So BABA stands for Black Applied Behavior Analysts. So they were established, I think, last year, 2 years ago. So last year was their first conference, and unfortunately, due to COVID, it was virtual. So this year, I had the opportunity to attend their first in-person conference. So I'm just going to read off of this screen, but BABA strives to promote diversity, inclusion, and equity in the ABA community. So the mission is to reduce the barriers and increase representation and empowerment of Black students, professionals, and caregivers in the field through education. So though it's the Black applied behavior analyst group, there was a lot of presenters who were not Black, and there was a lot of topics that were touched on and on all aspects of culture and diversity and inclusion. Some topics that were talked about were religion and spirituality in ABA, and also sexual orientation and gender. So it was a pretty interesting conference, and I learned a lot. It's a growing organization. It's fairly new, but it can make a really big impact on the field. Right. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so one of the topics that was discussed during the conference was this dissemination project, and it was presented by Dominic Shorter, who is a BCBA. So as we all know, there's a lot of skepticism revolving around the field of ABA. So as our field grows, the amount of critics towards the field also grows. So a large part of our role as supervisors is to advocate for our clients and our families and for ABA overall, right? But in order to advocate, we really have to understand the importance of dissemination and how to reach these different populations. So I know as clinicians, we're really big on, empirical research and article reviews and stuff like that. But when we're speaking to our caregivers, we're unlikely to pull up an article and say, oh, well, the research says XYZ, right? So we tailor these conversations in a manner that our caregivers are receptive to, right? So some of the challenges is that these underrepresented communities, they specifically touched on the Black community, but as we all know, there's other underrepresented communities. They really don't have a lot of ABA in their areas, and if they do, they're really skeptical about ABA. So we have to find novel and unconventional ways to disseminate what we do in a manner that people are going to be receptive to. So she actually, Dominique Shorter, for lack of better term, she is a TikTok phenomenon. So she actually has a son who's 9 who has autism. So he definitely drives that motivational factor for her. But she tries to disseminate ABA on different platforms. So YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, whatever that looks like for her. So again, as clinicians, we're like disseminating ABA through social media, right? But that's kind of how she's tapping into the younger generations and people in her community, and it's been working for her. So she actually provided an interesting example about disseminating ABA in a Christian church. So she actually partners with churches in her community, and she recognizes for that specific church, it's an African-American Baptist church. ABA is not something that they're very receptive to, but she identifies some kiddos in there that may benefit from ABA because I think she attends that church, right? So she actually set up a time to disseminate ABA in that church and tied it into their religious beliefs, right? So in this slide, if you look at number 2, it talks about preparing and practicing disseminating. So obviously you're not going to go into a church if you have no idea about that religion and how the impact of that religion. So she really took time to learn and practice disseminating for that specific group so that it is sensitive to their cultural viewpoints, but also beneficial, right? So she gave us 5 strategies for increasing the acceptance of ABA. So the first one is identifying the values and village of the audience. So kind of going back to that same conversation, right? She understood the values and the village of that Baptist church, right? So she prepared and practiced disseminating so that it's communicating in a manner that they're receptive to and likely to kind of implement into their daily lives or take the next steps in that process. As we all know, ABA has a lot of jargon. So avoid only using ABA jargon, right? So how can you communicate what we do in a way that's still, clinically appropriate, but not too much jargon so the listener doesn't get confused, right? Or just kind of shut down. And then you want to enhance and individualize your interpersonal skills. So I know that We all have our caregiver collaborations, and we understand that the way I communicate with one caregiver is not going to be the same manner that I communicate with another one. So really understanding your audience and learning how to individualize those interpersonal skills so that you can form those relationships and effectively disseminate ABA to those populations. And the last one is leave the 99 to find the one. So who can benefit from this information but is not receiving it? So a lot of my focus is ABA in the Black community, but I'm sure that other, racial, ethnic groups, cultures can attest to the fact that ABA is just not prevalent in their group, right? So how can we figure out who's not benefiting from these services and how can we mitigate those barriers so that everyone can receive the ABA services and support that they need? Okay, next slide. And then the second presentation that really stood out to me was about dismantling oppressive practices in clinical and academic supervision. So how to be a disruptor. So as clinicians, we all have supervisees, whether they're on track to becoming a BCBA or BCABA, or if they're just, RBTs and BTLs who don't really know their career path. Sorry, BCATs who don't know their career paths yet, right? So either way, we want to make sure that our supervisees feel safe and they feel like they can express themselves in a work environment that's not oppressive. So I'll kind of give you guys an example. We had an ASUP at one of our centers that I was helping to support. And before I started working at the center, I heard a lot of feedback from our RM, our GCM, previous supervisors, the OM about challenges with professionalism with this specific therapist. And it's very difficult because she is actually on track to becoming a BCBA. So there was a higher expectation for her, but she had a lot of just impulsive comments and things like that where people were just not so receptive to her. So to give you an example, I think the first time I went in there, she's a Black therapist. So I actually entered the office. I think it was my first time going to that office and seeing her. So she's sitting with a client and she was like, "Oh, I'm glad to see a Black BCBA. Also, can I know how much you're getting paid? Like, what's your salary?" Right? So it wasn't necessarily the comment that took me aback. Like, all my mentees who are pursuing their BCBA, I will answer those questions and let you know. But there's a time and a place for everything, right? Especially if you're sitting there with a client, this is not the time and the place, right? So that's just one example of just the impulsive behaviors that she has, right? So after speaking with all of our leadership team, I said, well, has anyone really sat down to talk to her to let her know that she's impulsive and it comes off as unprofessional? And everybody was like, well, no, not really, right? So she did have some mentor meetings and she's gotten a lot of feedback, but no one was really transparent with her about how she's being perceived and the status that she is in the center, like she needs to come off as more professional, basically, right? So I took some time to meet one-on-one with her and I was just very transparent. And I said, hey, this is what we're seeing. And I know that you want to do good. And I know that, you're really good, strong clinically. However, we need to improve that professionalism because if you're trying to grow in the company, you need to have set that standard, right? So then she disclosed to me that she does have ADHD and she's seeking to get evaluated for autism, right? So this kind of changed the whole conversation and it was a very good conversation. So now I'm looking at her from a different perspective because I'm like, okay, this makes a lot of sense, right? So when I went back to consult with the leadership team, I asked them, I said, has she ever disclosed this to you guys? And they're like, no, right? And she's been at CARD for like 3 or 4 years, right? And she's worked in the same office. So to me, I'm not saying she disclosed this to me because I was Black, right? But I can only assume that she felt a little bit safer with me without that fear of kind of judgment. And, honestly, hearing someone say, I care, but this is how you're coming off. What can we do to help you was really helpful for her, right? So I say all this to say they gave us a lot of tips and tricks for just kind of dismantling those oppressive practices so that our supervisees feel comfortable and safe. And eventually, this can help with things like retention, right? We want our therapists to feel safe so that they grow in the company and eventually become a BCBA, right? If that's their career path. So one of the topics we talked about was just code switching. So this is very common in the Black community for Black professionals. It's almost second nature to kind of adjust the way that we're speaking or coming off so that we seem a little bit softer or more, professional. So one of the tips and tricks they were giving us to let our supervisees know is like to stop code switching, right? So when I'm having my mentor meetings with my mentees, I make sure that they know that this is a safe place to communicate and whatever you say, we're good, right? Obviously, if you're talking to a parent, you're going to have to kind of communicate in a professional manner, but just knowing you have that safe space is very important for our supervisees. And then also recognizing that tone policing. So I know this is very common, especially with Black therapists and BCBAs, where often kind of there's jokes like, oh, like that kid's scared of you, or yeah, you'll get them straight, right? And it's kind of like a laughing thing, but it does come off as tone policing and kind of, it's a microaggression, right? To say that a therapist is coming off as aggressive when, her tone of voice is just a little bit different than, say, like her white counterpart, right? So again, we're not condoning therapists yelling at a client or being intentionally mean, but before correcting someone, especially a Black professional, on tone policing, ask yourself, like, are they disrespecting the client and they're not treating that client with dignity, or is it just their tone is a little bit different than mine, and that's okay, right? And obviously, if it's the first option, then we need to address that. Okay, that's up for that slide. Alrighty, so I don't know if you guys have ever pulled the demographic data from the BACB, but we kind of just wanted to touch on the demographic data. So this is the overall snapshot. So this includes BCBAs, BCBADs, BCABAs, and RBTs. So this is the overall demographic data for just race and ethnicity. So I just wanted to kind of open the floor or chat box for any comments or trends that you're seeing here, or any just first thoughts.
That's a lot of white.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Is this us or globally certified? I believe it's global. I could be completely wrong. Good question though. But this is the only demographic data on the board website, so I'm assuming it's globally. Yes. So it's a lot of white. That's pretty much the gist of it. I mean, it's not a surprise where it's a field that's dominated.
If I can share, my name is Diana. If I can share, the growing Hispanic community is a responsibility that I have, because we're growing a lot of young technicians who are Hispanic and don't always know how to write well or express themselves well or be assertive enough.
Yeah.
So this is a big telltale sign.
Yeah, and thank you for touching on that, Diana. And actually, you're going to be really surprised at the next slide, because we actually touch on the Hispanic population when it comes to RBTs and BCBAs. But yeah, so this is the demographic data. So if you want to go to the next. So if you see this demographic data, so this is the RBTs on the right, and then the BCBAs on the left. BCABAs, I did not forget about you guys, but the data look pretty similar as far as race and ethnicity. So that's why I kind of left that one out. But as you see here, right, I'm specifically looking at the Hispanic population. When you see 10.56% of BCBAs are Hispanic versus the 27.02% who RBTs who are Hispanic, right? So when it comes to supervision practices and mentorship, what kind of challenges might you see with this demographic information, specifically for like the Hispanic RBT to BCBA ratio?
It seems like a lot of white BCBAs are going to be mentoring a lot of Hispanic RBTs.
Yeah, exactly, right? And this is not going to say that, every supervisee needs a supervisor who is their same race or ethnic group, because that's not practical, nor is it possible, right? But when we are talking about growing in a company, or growing in general, not just a company, but growing in your position, a lot of times people want to see mentors and supervisors who look like them and have those shared social and cultural experiences, right? So of course, I can only really speak on the Black population, but from my experience as a Black BCBA with my Black supervisees, a lot of them have said to me, like, we don't see a lot of Black BCBAs, so I'm really happy that you're my BCBA and you're my mentor, right? I can't speak for every other racial or ethnic group, but this is something that, and again, we're a growing field, so I can only assume that these numbers are going to change drastically over the next few years, because we're becoming more diverse in practice. But this definitely is something to kind of look at and consider, especially when we're talking about supervision practices and mentorship, right, and growth in like professional growth. Okay. Thank you, Adam, for your input. Okay.